Christoph Germann joins us for this edition of the Guadalajara Geopolitics podcast. He is a student of political science. He writes for Sybil Edmonds' Boiling Frogs Post, and his blog is called The New Great Game, reflecting one of his primary areas of interest. You can find his writings on boilingfrogspost.com and christophgermann.blogspot.com, as well as a monthly podcast he does at porkinspolicyreview.com, which is now accepting Patreon support, and which you can tell us about that a little bit later. But welcome, Christoph.
Thanks for having me.
Today, I'd like to cover two key issues: a general overview of the new great game in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and a brief summary of the attempted coup in Turkey recently. And so let's begin with Central Asia. The original Great Game took place between the Russian and British empires during the 19th century. The game continues today between the nation of Russia and the American Empire, together with a China rising. You describe this new great game on your website as the struggle for influence, power, hegemony, and profits between a US-dominated NATO, its GCC or Gulf Community proxies, Russia, China, and other regional players. Some of the Central Asian countries have chosen sides, while others seem to meander between the Washington or Moscow, Beijing axis, if you will, or alliance. Central Asia is an absolutely wonderful place. I used to live in Mongolia, and taking Mongolia as just a quick example, it seems to not have quite yet aligned itself with either Washington or Moscow. And you can correct me if I'm wrong there. It seems to maintain a central or neutral position. I like to call it the Switzerland of Central Asia. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan seem to be in Russian sphere, while Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan seem to be more independent. And your news roundups that you do on your website, you've discussed, I guess, a few months back, Afghanistan, which is under U.S. influence, but has turned to Russia, asking Russia for help to fight against ISIS. So it seems a little bit of history repeating. And you've been bringing up Georgia and the Caucasus quite a lot. It seems there's the U.S. struggle to maintain influence there. So from your years of research and following the new great game, could you give us the big idea and where you think things stand? Who currently has the edge in the new great game?
Yes, so my work focuses mainly on the area that Brzezinski called the Eurasian Balkans in his famous book, The Grand Chessboard. And the Eurasian Balkans include 9 countries: the 3 states of the Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, the 5 Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And as you probably know, there are different geostrategic theories on how to attain global primacy. For example, Alfred T. Mahan formulated the concept of sea power, according to which naval dominance was the deciding factor. Halford Mackinder, on the other hand, promoted the heartland theory, which he summarized as: who rules East Europe commands the heartland, who rules the heartland commands the world island, and who rules the world island commands the world. And Mackinder's heartland theory has been very influential and prompted, for example, Nicholas Bückman to develop his rimland theory as an alternative to Mackinder. And Brzezinski then picked up where Mackinder and Bückman left off and formulated a Eurasian geostrategy for the United States. And Brzezinski identifies Eurasia as the center of global power, and he emphasizes that in order to retain global primacy, the United States must ensure that no state or alliance of states gains the capacity to seriously challenge or even expel the United States from Eurasia. And one area that's very important in this regard are, of course, the Eurasian Balkans, due to its vast amount of natural resources, which include minerals as well as enormous oil and gas reserves. For example, Turkmenistan is estimated to hold the 4th largest natural gas reserves in the world. And after the end of the Soviet Union, several countries wanted to get a piece of the pie, most notably, of course, the United States, Russia, and China. But also other regional powers such as Turkey and Iran have been vying for influence in the region. And during the 1990s and early 2000s, the United States exploited Russia's problems and tried to remove as many former Soviet republics as possible from Russia's sphere of influence, not only in Eastern Europe, but also in Central Asia and the Caucasus region. And Azerbaijan was one of the first countries that was brought into the US NATO camp in the mid-1990s, thanks to a combination of blackmail and credible threats. Former Azerbaijani President Heydar Aliyev initially refused to abandon his old KGB friends until he was almost killed in a coup attempt in March 1995. And the coup had been organized by Turkish Gladio operatives such as Abdullah Chatli on behalf of the United States. Chatli died 1 year later in a very interesting car crash in Turkey, which sparked the so-called Sursuluk scandal and marked a transition from the original Operation Gladio to Gladio B. And Azerbaijan would become one of the main conduits for the Gladio B operations. The coup attempt, Ilham Aliyev's gambling debts to the Turkish mafia and other blackmail material convinced the Aliyev clan to join the US NATO camp. And Azerbaijan is very important due to its vast energy resources and its strategic location bordering Russia and Iran, which is can also be seen in the pipeline competition, which we can touch upon a bit later. So Azerbaijan was brought into the US NATO camp in the mid-1990s, thanks to a combination of threats and blackmail. But in Georgia, we saw a different strategy, the color revolution model, which has become very popular and has been implemented in several post-Soviet republics. In the early 2000s, Georgia saw a huge rise of NGOs, many of them funded by George Soros' Open Society Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy, and similar organizations. These NGOs supported the United National Movement led by Mikhail Saakashvili. And in 2003, they organized the so-called Rose Revolution that brought Saakashvili and his party to power. Ever since, Georgia has been pursuing a pro-Western foreign policy and became a close US ally. And Saakashvili did his best to turn Georgia into a US colony, and he was hell-bent on provoking a conflict with Russia. In 2008, he even started a war with Russia, apparently thinking that the United States would back him. But this was clearly not the case, and Georgia suffered a devastating defeat. And since Saakashvili's United National Movement lost power to Bidzina Ivanishvili's Georgian Dream Coalition in 2012, the Georgian government has been taking a more pragmatic approach vis-à-vis Russia. And more recently, we've also seen a rise of pro-Russian sentiments in Georgia. But the government remains committed to Euro-Atlantic integration and wants to join NATO. Georgia is as close to NATO membership as you can possibly get, but due to strong opposition from Germany and France, for example, this is not going to happen anytime soon. So if we look at the Caucasus, we have two close US allies, Azerbaijan and Georgia, and one close Russian ally, Armenia. Armenia is a member of the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is more or less Russia's answer to NATO. And all attempts to remove Armenia from Russia's sphere of influence have failed so far. In Central Asia, the situation is somewhat different and not as clearly defined as you already noted. Central Asia saw its first color revolution in 2005 when the Tulip Revolution, supported by the usual suspects, replaced one corrupt leader with a more pliable corrupt leader. Kyrgyzstan is also very important due to its strategic location bordering Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and China. When the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, the US military opened an air base in Kyrgyzstan, Manas Air Base, to support the war in Afghanistan. And this base was used for all kinds of nefarious activities and played a vital role in US operations. That's why the United States has tried to install US-friendly regimes in Bishkek. And this worked pretty well until Almazbek Atambayev was elected in 2011. At first, the Atambayev government played along, but over time they moved closer to Russia. And in 2013, the Kyrgyz government gave into pressure from Russia and told the United States to leave Manas air base. In 2014, all US forces left Manas and the base was closed. This fight between the United States and Russia over Manas is a good indicator of when US influence was stronger in Kyrgyzstan and when the Russians gained the upper hand again. So Kyrgyzstan remains a close US ally, but the United States is obviously not going to give up. Just last year, they sent counter-revolution expert Richard Miles to Kyrgyzstan. Miles had been the US ambassador to Georgia during the Rose Revolution. And it didn't take long before he made headlines in Kyrgyzstan. He was caught on video meeting with a local NGO leader after the same guy had just organized a small protest in front of the presidential building. So these are, of course, the same usual tactics that we've seen in many countries in the last years. But for the most part, these tactics haven't been successful in Central Asia. Uzbekistan welcomed the US with open hands in 2001 and offered them to use an airbase for the war in Afghanistan. But Uzbekistan's leader Islam Karimov kicked the Americans out a few years later in 2005 when they voiced concerns about the human rights situation after the Andijan massacre. Karimov tries to keep both the United States and Russia at arm's length. Neighboring Turkmenistan prides itself on its neutrality and tries as best as it can to minimize foreign influence in the country. Turkmenistan's leader, Berdimuhamedov, is primarily interested in his own personality cult and in preserving his power. And as you noted, Tajikistan and Kazakhstan cooperate with the United States in some areas, but at the end of the day, they also side with Russia. So that's a broad overview of the situation in the Eurasian Balkans.
And who would you say, after saying all that, seems to have the edge, or is it pretty square, pretty even at the moment?
I would say the United States has reached some of its objectives in the Caucasus. Russian influence overall has diminished, but the big winner is actually China. Because in recent years, China has gradually improved its relation with the Central Asian republics and upgraded the relations with all 5 countries to a strategic partnership level. The Central Asian republics play a vital role in supplying China's rising energy demand and in building a new Silk Road. China's One Belt, One Road initiative focuses on improving connectivity and cooperation between China and the rest of Eurasia. The plan consists of 2 components, the ocean-going maritime Silk Road and the land-based Silk Road economic belt. And Central Asian republics are an important part of this Silk Road economic belt, which includes countries situated on the original Silk Road and stretches from China all the way to Western Europe. China's interest in Central Asia is both a blessing and a curse for the Central Asian republics. On the one hand, China is willing to invest huge sums of money without voicing any concerns about human rights violations and the like, as Western countries usually do. But on the other hand, China's rising influence is also creating problems for the Central Asian countries. For example, Turkmenistan is almost completely dependent on China for its gas exports. They're desperately trying to diversify their gas exports, but several pipeline projects like the Tapi pipeline or the Trans-Caspian gas pipeline haven't made much progress in recent years. So they are more or less dependent on China and have almost no leverage in price negotiations. And just to give another example, in Kazakhstan, we have recently seen a wave of land protests, which have also to do with China's rising influence. Kazakhstan's government is planning to sell off unused farming land and change the law to allow foreigners to rent agricultural land in Kazakhstan for 25 years. Up until now, foreigners were only allowed to rent land for 10 years. And many people in Kazakhstan vehemently oppose this because they fear that the Chinese will swoop in, buy all the farming land, and not leave the country ever again. So the Central Asian republics are becoming worried about China's rising influence, but usually they don't have much choice. The local governments are most interested in preserving their own power and are unwilling to undertake necessary reforms.
And any thoughts on Pipelineistan, as Pepe Escobar describes it, in regards to all of this.
Yes, I like his pipeline is time term. It's very appropriate, yeah. So one of the main objectives of the United States in the Eurasian Balkans has been to bring oil and gas from the Caspian Sea to its allies while bypassing Russia and Iran. And Azerbaijan plays a vital role in this regard. It should come as no surprise that none other than Brzezinski traveled to Baku in 1995 to negotiate what would later become the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline. The pipeline is running from one close US ally to the next and pumping oil from Azerbaijan's oil fields in the Caspian Sea to the Turkish port of Ceyhan on the Mediterranean. And the BTC pipeline and the parallel running BTE gas pipeline are perfect examples of Washington's energy strategy in Eurasia. There are many other projects in the works or in planning that follow the same strategy. For example, Azerbaijan and Turkey are currently working on the Trans-Anatolian gas pipeline that is designed to transport gas from Azerbaijan across Georgia and Turkey to the Turkish-Greek border, where the pipeline will be connected with the Trans-Adriatic pipeline to bring the gas to Italy. This so-called Southern Gas Corridor is seen as vital in reducing Europe's dependence on Russian gas, which is one of the main US objectives. That's why the United States and its allies have also been promoting the idea of a Trans-Caspian pipeline to bring gas from Turkmenistan to Azerbaijan and then to Europe while bypassing Russia and Iran. But the unresolved legal status of the Caspian Sea, the high costs of the project, and strong opposition from Moscow and Tehran have prevented the implementation of this project so far. And a similar project that the United States has been promoting since the 1990s is the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, also known as TAPI. The TAPI project was one reason for the NATO invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, but the volatile security situation and disagreements with the Taliban over their share of the profit have hampered the implementation of this project to this day. And the United States and its Saudi allies especially have done their best to prevent Iran and Pakistan from building the Iran-Pakistan pipeline, which could be extended to India as well as China and would therefore make TAPI redundant. So there are some interesting pipeline games going on in Pipelinistan.
And I don't think we can overstate the importance of the resources in these regions, because you mentioned Afghanistan. There was a New York Times piece a few years ago that mentioned how there's over $1 trillion worth of resources in Mongolia, where I used to live. There's $1 trillion worth of minerals, and so on. And another final point regarding Central Asia that I'd like to discuss would be the role of radical Islam. And I thought I'd just give a brief context going back to the Great Game of the 19th century. Last semester, I taught a course on world history, and we looked at China's century of humiliation in the 1800s when the British Empire was all over China, and you had the Opium Wars. And so, in one of your recent pieces, you mentioned the radicalized Chechen terrorists, which were used by U.S. NATO as a strategic weapon, to wreak havoc on the enemies of U.S. NATO. You didn't put it quite like that, but they came out of Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and there was a terrorist attack in Turkey. And I thought there was a parallel. If we go back to the 19th century, we had the Empress Shishi of China, and you had this secret society of the Boxers. And this group was somewhat volatile. They disliked foreigners, and they also had some beef with the Chinese empress. And it seemed that she tried to steer the Boxers to use them against the British imperialism, but she was well aware that her own reign could be threatened by the Boxers, a sort of a Frankenstein. And so, how do you view radical Islam today in this context? Because it seems China, as you described, is their one belt, one road. They're using an economic strategy. Russia seems to be using an economic strategy as their weapon with the Eurasian Economic Union and integrating Kazakhstan and all these countries. And it seems the U.S. seems to have weaponized radical Islam as their weapon. So what's your thoughts on radical Islam?
Yes, I quickly mentioned the Gladio B operations in passing, but these have, of course, been one of the main weapons that are used by the United States in this region. The underlying philosophy behind these operations is easily explained. There's a famous quote that is being attributed to former CIA official Wayne Fuller. He reportedly said the policy of guiding the evolution of Islam and of helping them against our adversaries worked marvelously well in Afghanistan against the Russians. The same doctrines can still be used to destabilize what remains of Russian power and especially to counter the Chinese influence in Central Asia. And that's exactly what they have been doing since the 1990s. And one organization that has played a vital role in this regard is the Gülen movement, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It has now has now made the headlines in Turkey after the recent coup attempt. During the 1990s, Fethullah Gülen and his network established a lot of schools and madrasas in Central Asia and the Caucasus region, and even in Russia. And according to former Turkish intelligence official Nuri Gündeş, in the 1990s, the movement sheltered up to 130 CIA agents at its schools in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan alone. And as FBI whistleblower Sybil Edmonds stated in her deposition in 2009, Gülen's vast network in Central Asia was used to train Mujahideen-like militia for these operations. This was done in close cooperation with Turkish military and Pakistan's intelligence service ISI. And these Gladio B operations were led by the Pentagon, CIA, MI6, and NATO. But there were a lot of other interesting actors involved. And whereas the original Gladio operations relied on fascist and Nazi elements, these Gladio B operations were modeled after Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan and relied on Mujahideen. And two of the main objectives have been to destabilize Russia's North Caucasus, in particular Chechnya, and to destabilize China's vital Xinjiang province, which borders Mongolia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Xinjiang is vital for China's One Belt, One Road project. And in order to destabilize Xinjiang, the United States and NATO have been using China's Muslim Uyghur population as pawns, and they have been supporting the East Turkestan independence movement, which aims to create its own independent state in today's Xinjiang. And in 2004, they even set up the East Turkestan government in exile in Washington, D.C. And the man who was elected the prime minister of the East Turkestan government in exile is Anwar Yusuf Turani, who was investigated by the FBI along with a list of other illustrious characters such as Graham Fuller, Eric Edelman, Douglas Fife, Richard Pearl, Brent Scowcroft, and others. They were investigated by the FBI in the late 1990s as a part of a counterintelligence investigation known as Gladio B. Since these operations in Central Asia and the Caucasus were intertwined with countless criminal activities, including arms and drug trafficking, the FBI investigated several senior US officials until higher-ups noticed that this had been sanctioned at the highest level and shut down the investigation. And on behalf of the Pentagon and State Department, the Justice Department then later invoked the state secrets privilege against Sybil Edmonds when she tried to blow the whistle on these operations and on the cover-up at the FBI.
And any final thoughts on Central Asia before we go on to Turkey? What are you keeping your eye on at the moment?
I would say that US influence in Central Asia US interest in Central Asia has gradually decreased in recent years. These operations that we are just talking about, these were especially going on in the late 1990s, early 2000s, but especially since 2011, since the United States has focused on trying to topple the government in Syria, they don't have put too much effort in increasing their influence and in removing countries from Russia's sphere of influence in Central Asia. I remember when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she made a big announcement about the United States building its own Silk Road in Central Asia. And they haven't done anything in this direction. This was just an empty announcement. The only ones that have been building a Silk Road are the Chinese.
That'd be quite far-fetched, I think, for the US to be doing that. Let's turn briefly to the attempted coup in Turkey. There are a few theories, and I came up with listed four. Maybe you can add some, but first, that it was a faction within the Turkish state and military which attempted the coup. Two, that it was an attempted coup by the United States, presumably with that Turkish faction. That it was a false flag operation carried out by Erdogan himself, or that it could have been a false flag operation carried out by both Erdogan and the US. I guess at the moment it might seem that it was an attempted coup by the US, NATO. What are your thoughts?
I would just start by explaining a little bit about the Gülen movement, because that's very important in this regard, and I think many people don't know a lot about this organization, because it's not very transparent about its activities. And there's a good reason for that, because former members actually describe the movement as an ultra-conservative secret society. Some have compared it to Scientology or Opus Dei. And it's important to point out that this network has a strict hierarchical order. Fethullah Gülen, who is a Turkish preacher and former imam, and who lives in the United States since 1999, he's at the top of the pyramid. And individual world regions, like Central Asia or Europe, are each managed by a local leader. There's a public Gülen education program that's presented to the outside world. They're operating schools in more than 150 countries. But there's also a hidden indoctrination program that takes place in so-called houses of light, which are the real foundation of the Gülen movement. These houses of light are dormitories where Gülen followers are taught to become loyal servants and to devote themselves to the movement. Former members have likened it to prison because they have almost no personal freedoms, and the movement dictates their life, including which books they are allowed to read and which profession they should choose. The Gülen movement has a hidden agenda, and this agenda was exposed in Turkey in 1999 when a speech that Gülen had given to his followers was leaked to Turkish media. And during this speech, Gülen told his followers to move in the arteries of the system without anyone noticing until they reach all the power centers. And that's exactly what the Gülen movement has been doing in Turkey in the last decades with remarkable success. They have infiltrated all important government institutions, from the judiciary to the police onto the armed forces. And when this explosive speech was leaked in 1999, Gülen had to flee to the United States, where he was welcomed with open arms because he was their go-to guy for the Gladio B operations. After the AKP came to power with Erdogan, the AKP and the Gülen movement made a close alliance, and they became close allies. And the AKP didn't do anything against the infiltration of the state institutions by the Gülen movement, but tolerated it or even supported it. And this all changed in late 2013. Because in late 2013, the Gülen movement targeted Erdogan and the AKP in a huge corruption scandal. For years, there had been a similar conflict between the AKP and the Gülen movement over several issues such as the Mavi Marmara incident or peace talks with the Kurds. But this conflict escalated into all-out war in December 2013. Up until that point, Erdogan's corruption had never been a problem. But when Erdogan and his associates used the gas for gold scheme to circumvent US sanctions against Iran, that upset quite a few people. And as Fethullah Gülen's former second in command pointed out in a recent interview, the Gülen movement has not only close ties with the CIA, but also with Mossad. Gülen is a big supporter of Israel, and he takes a hard line on Russia and Iran. And that's important to keep in mind when we also look at the recent coup, where Russia and Iran have come out in support of Erdogan, for example. Whereas the United States and NATO haven't been so happy with the result of the coup, I would say. So the big fallout between Gülen and Erdogan happened in December 2013. And just 1 month later, you could see which side the United States deep state was choosing. In January 2014, the Washington Post published an op-ed written by 2 former US ambassadors to Turkey, Morten Abramovich and Eric Edelman, more or less calling for the overthrow of Erdogan. And the Gülen movement was already working on Erdogan's overthrow in Turkey, but Erdogan survived the corruption scandal, the exposure of Turkish arms transfers to Syria, as well as all kinds of damning leaks. And he responded with a crackdown on the Gülen movement and launched one purge after another. One of the most significant developments came in March of this year, when Erdogan shut down Gülen's mouthpiece Zaman. And this prompted Morten Abramovich and Eric Edelman to write another Washington Post op-ed titled "Erdogan must reform or resign." And by late March, a speculation about a military coup in Turkey had reached a point where the US State Department spokesman was asked during the daily press briefing if the United States was trying to overthrow the Erdogan government. And 2 days later, after this interesting press briefing, while Erdogan was in Washington, the Turkish military even released an unusual statement dismissing speculation about a coup as baseless. So this coup attempt didn't come out of nowhere. That's important to keep in mind. There had been rumors floating around that something was about to happen in July. And this makes perfect sense given that Turkey's Supreme Military Council meeting was scheduled for early August. And the Supreme Military Council decides on promotions and appointments of generals and admirals in the Turkish armed forces. And the Gülenists that had infiltrated the armed forces feared that the council was planning to discharge most of them because the Turkish government wanted to see mass purges. And one of the most important missions of the newly appointed Chief of General Staff, Hulusi Akar, was to combat the Gülenists in the armed forces. And there were several lists circulating with names of suspected Gülenists. So the window of opportunity for a Gülenist coup was closing in July. And the Erdogan government was, of course, waiting for something to happen. That is why they were more or less prepared and noticed the coup attempt that was originally planned for 3 a.m. later that night, already on Friday afternoon, forcing the coup plotters to launch their operation earlier. And this was one of the main reasons why the coup failed.
And it seems more often than not, the U.S. calculates pretty coldly, and when they attempt a coup, it would seem, I mean, usually they do a pretty good job. This didn't go well, but also we see there's parallels, I think, with Saddam, for example. Saddam was installed with U.S. assistance way back when, and it seemed like he wasn't quite following the Washington line, and so we had the Iraq invasion in 1990. It kind of seemed like they tried to scare him, right? And they didn't quite overthrow him. They left him in power after Operation Desert Storm. And the second time, they finally came back and got him. And Sybil Edmonds recently in the interview that she did with James Corbett said that this could be a run-up to a much bigger coup. What do you think?
I think this was supposed to be the real thing. They really tried to remove him, but it didn't work for a number of reasons. There were just small key developments. For example, the commander of the First Army in Istanbul, Ümit Dündar, refused to join the coup plotters, which was one of the key developments. He called Erdogan early on and warned him and persuaded him to go to fly to Istanbul from Marmaris, the holiday resort where he was staying, instead of trying to reach Ankara. And from the WhatsApp messages that have been released by some of the soldiers that were involved in the coup in Istanbul, you could see that these were subordinates of General Dündar, and they were trying to arrest him, to capture him the whole time during this coup attempt, because Dündar was refusing to cooperate with them and went even on Turkish media and told the public that the coup plotters only represent a small fraction within the military, and that those responsible will be punished, and that they are acting outside the chain of command. That was one of the key developments, as well as Hulusi Akar, the chief of staff, who was taken hostage by the coup plotters in Ankara. He also refused to cooperate with them, and they wanted Akar to sign an order commanding all units to join the coup and to go on TV and tell the nation that the entire army, the army with its entire chain of command, had been taken over. And according to Akar's recent testimony, they also offered to put him in touch with Fethullah Gülen, their opinion leader, as they called him. If this testimony by Akar is genuine, this directly implicates Gülen in the coup attempt. And if Akar had cooperated with them, or if General Dündar had cooperated with them, I don't think that Erdogan would have been able to foil the coup plot that easily. He could have perhaps provoked a civil war, but that's of course something completely different.
Mm-hmm. And well, closing thoughts on Turkey, on the new great game, on Central Asia. It seems like I think it looks like we're going to be seeing greater turmoil in general in the region. What are your thoughts?
Yes, so this coup has the potential to upset the global chessboard. A lot of people are already saying that Erdogan is now breaking with the US-NATO alliance and establishing more closer ties with Russia and Iran. And Russia and Iran have been very supportive of Erdogan. Just the other day, the Turkish government thanked the Russian government for its unconditional support during the coup attempt. And one of Erdogan's first foreign visits, or even the first foreign trip after the coup attempt, will be to Moscow in early August. I don't quite see Erdogan really abandoning NATO because he has always tried to play it both sides and always tried to get the best out for himself. He's more interested in power. But this coup has really set up a lot of interesting developments, and it's definitely one of the most important things currently what you can watch when it comes to geopolitics. For example, currently Yeni Shafak, which is a very pro-government Turkish media site, is directly accusing retired US Army General John F. Campbell of being the mastermind behind the coup. That's really unprecedented. And just the other day, multiple sources confirmed to civil admins and to Newsbot that NBC is likely source for their story. They put out a story at the height of the coup that Erdogan was seeking asylum in Germany. And this was before Erdogan appeared on CNN Turk via FaceTime, and it was clear that he was still in Turkey. So they put up a story basically saying the president is fleeing the country, and 30 minutes later they even doubled down and said Germany had refused Erdogan's request for asylum, and he thought to be flying to London. And these stories were all based on an unnamed senior US military source. And according to multiple sources with apparent insider knowledge, this source was very likely General John F. Campbell, it's the same general who is now being accused by Turkish pro-government media of being the mastermind behind the coup. So that's a really, really interesting development.
Mm-hmm. Well, and finally, here's a question that I always ask our guests. Yourself as an analyst of political science, what have you learned over the years that has helped you to better analyze the true nature of events in world politics?
Read as many sources as possible. Don't limit yourself to Western media, as I have been doing for most of my life. I think the real turning point for me was the war in Syria. Up until that point, I had always believed what was written in the New York Times, what was written in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung or in Der Spiegel. And only this conflict really really changed my view on Western media, and how they're really often trying to promote one narrative. But what we've seen not only in Syria but also in Ukraine and many other conflicts. So I would encourage people to read as many sources as possible and as many opposing views as possible, and to make up their own mind.
And you're creating your own media. If you'd like to tell us about your various sites that you're involved with.
So my blog is christophgermann.blogspot.com, and since 2013 I have been writing for boilingfrogspost.com, which is the site of Sibel Edmonds. And Sibel has been working on a new media project called Newsbot. The first stage of our Kickstarter campaign, which consists of 4 stages, has been successful, and she has been working on setting up the site. And I will be writing for Newsbot later this year, probably at the end of September, when I have more time and don't have to focus as much on my studies.
Okay, and you're also a guest on Porkins Policy Review.
Yes.
.com.
Yeah. Piers Redmond is a good friend of mine, and we have been doing a geopolitics podcast focusing mostly on Central Asia and the Caucasus region. And we try to do about 1 show per month. And we have been setting up a new Patreon campaign that you can use to support our podcast if you want. And you can visit my site and find a link there, or you can just follow us on Twitter. My Twitter handle is New Great Game.
Okay, well, Christoph, thanks a lot for your time and for the talk.
Thanks for having me.